Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 12th of November 2023. Not a crazy amount to go through in this. I said that in the last one, still half an hour video, so you know me. Anyway, military aid. No reason except Ukraine has a lot of them and they move very well in mud and swampy terrain as well as snow. Just what you need for a river crossing, says Trent Tolenko. What's he talking about? Well, David D talks about anyone following Ukraine needs to get smart on this vehicle quick. This is a Barnvan 206. I have shown you this Wikipedia page before, actually. There are a number of these vehicles out there. This isn't anything that's just been given or anything like that, but there are a number of these vehicles. I showed you a video of one crossing some water and saying, goodness me, I wouldn't like to be in that. I did that with a BMP the other day as well. But one of these that was going through the water and just looked like it wasn't particularly stable, or that it, it looked like it's going to sink. I mean, it's a big hunk of metal, right? However, these are really useful bits of kit. They have quite a lot of them that have been given by particularly Germany, I think, and I think maybe Sweden or some Nordic states might give them some. These are just the sort of vehicles you might want to see crossing Dnipro to help support that bridgehead developing on the left bank of the Dnipro River in Kherson. Right. Germany will increase its military aid budget to Ukraine from 4 billion euros to 8 billion euros in 2024. This is huge. There's consensus among parties in the Bundestag, and the budget committee is expected to approve the budget next week, according to the Bild. Germany is going to double the planned military aid, says Tendar, who's a German source. And he says that's impressive, making it by far the second largest contributor of all military aid to Ukraine in real terms. And that is something I've been talking about a lot the last week. So what does Bloomberg say about this? Well, Chancellor Olaf Scholz's governing coalition has agreed to double the German military aid to Ukraine next year. It's if approved by Parliament in Berlin, where Scholz's parties hold a majority, the boost would lift Germany's defense spending beyond the 2% of gross domestic product target pledged by all NATO members, according to the People. Now, this is important because Germany has been seen as one of these big countries in NATO that hasn't been adhering to the 2% of GDP spent on defense to qualify for or as a criteria for NATO. This will definitely do that. And also, when you look at, despite their kind of spending, what they've given, and that's two different things. It doesn't necessarily mean that they've spent that because they're giving from their stocks or etc., etc. But what they've given to Ukraine over the last year has been fantastic, and actually places them in the number 2 position already, even though they might not have spent 2% of their GDP on defense. So there are several things going on here. Anyway, lawmakers of Scholz's Social Democrats, the Free Democrats, and the Green Party agreed to increase in negotiations over the proposed 2024 federal budget this week, said the People, who asked not to be identified since the plan isn't public yet. A defense ministry spokesman declined to comment. Scholz has pledged a significant expansion of military capabilities even after a special fund for defense spending is exhausted as Germany builds out its role as NATO's European hub. Germany is Ukraine's biggest military backer in Europe and is second globally only to the US. I think you've seen Germany change in terms of being a military mouse. Not in its technical capabilities, but in the way it projects itself due to the Second World War and it being very cognizant of its own history. Germany has been very quiet on what it does militarily, and that changed last year, didn't it? Where they suddenly said we're going to start spending more and more, and this is a really big thing for Germany. And now they've just they're growing into that role where I think they're thinking, right, we can be a hub in Europe, as far as rather than America coming to Europe, and it does have those bases in Germany, etc., but Germany itself taking control of maybe European military matters and whatnot. I think there could be a strategic shift there happening as we speak. So the budget committee of the Bundestag, the lower house of parliament, is expected to approve the additional 4 billion next week, which would increase German defense spending to 2.1% of GDP. Germany has channeled more than 17 billion euros in military aid to Ukraine, according to data tracked by the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. That includes Leopard 2 main battle tanks, Marder armor infantry fighting vehicles, Iris-T and Patriot anti-missile systems, Gepard anti-aircraft guns, and multiple rocket launches. Scholz announced €100 billion fund 3 days after Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, and 2/3 are expected to be allocated by the end of the year. That's projected to put Germany's defense budget at 2% of GDP for the first time in more than 3 decades. They also are planning on buying a bunch of other stuff from America and Israel. Interestingly, this has reminded me of something that I had down to share with you that isn't here, and it's to do with France. Hang on. Right, this isn't the article, but it's a similar one. It's what I could find. The idea is that France is actually pulling its weight, but other people aren't giving them kudos for doing so because they aren't part of the let's announce it in public brigade. Actually, I just remembered it was a comment, a really good comment from Aimer. Jonathan, sorry for the long read. I'm not myself French, but a happy French taxpayer, so this does concern me. So what is this about? A recent article in Le Monde published the results of a parliamentary inquiry on how much France has contributed military-wise to Ukraine. The result is that French contributes sort of on par with Germany and Britain, up to €3.2 billion. Let's put aside the figures for a while. The amount is not enough anyway. What is relevant is why the parliament had to publish those figures. They state the Kiel Institute figures are strongly biased because they only analyze officially declared aid, and that's all you can do, right? You can't analyze aid that you don't know about, obviously. So it's just what is officially declared, and France generally doesn't declare what it gives. And this is something I've said before. Sometimes you see French equipment, you're like, oh, I didn't know that was given. So this is really important. But also, some of the material given by other EU countries is in fact financed through France. But on top of that, France and maybe other more Latin countries do not flout about the nice presents they give. The same goes at Christmas. Giving is considered here more a selfless act. Doing otherwise is not considered respectful. Secondly, as you have stated many times, we would like our enemy to know that something has been given only once we see the effect in the field. The French military puts that into practice. I would also add that reading out in English is also a strong bias. Most of what is communicated in Europe is not in English, and the extra effort of translating is not always done, even by the Kiel Institute. I very often see this bias. Thus, a lot of stuff simply goes under the radar. Talking of which, as you put things, I think we can see the picture on the long run. The asymmetry between the quality of targeting is now obvious. Everything that emits electro and so on and so. It then gets technical about stuff being given. Right, but this is really important because I have staved off being overly critical of France because I have figured, and I know a lot of people have been in the past saying, oh, France, and sometimes ago, oh, France could do a little bit more. But I'm not like totally on it at France because I've been fairly sure stuff has been happening. I keep talking about satellite intelligence sharing, but I'm sure there's other stuff happening. And that is indeed what has been the case, as according to these reports and that comment. So be careful when you insult other countries in terms of not giving certain stuff or not giving enough stuff in comparison to X and Y country, because you are deriving that knowledge from what is publicly announced, and of course that assumes that everything is given is that which is publicly announced. We know that even the US doesn't do that. There's a lot of US equipment that suddenly turns up, you're like, oh, that wasn't announced. You know, those decoy missiles, the MAL decoy missiles, they were never announced, they're suddenly being used. So I think that's really important to remember. Anyway, Politico says the numbers showing that France is the military skinflint among European countries when it comes to donating weapons and ammunition into Ukraine don't paint the full picture, French lawmakers argue in a report presented Wednesday. The MPs want to deconstruct what may have been said or written about France's aid that would not live up to our ambitions. Lionel Royer-Perrault, a deputy from French President Emmanuel Macron's Renaissance Party and the report's co-author told reporters, quote, some have a vested interest in letting things flourish on social networks to destabilize the Western Bloc. Others because of intra-European competition, he added. When asked what's driving criticism of France, France and Ukraine did start on the wrong foot. In the war's early days, Macron insisted Putin should not be humiliated and suggested that Moscow deserves security guarantees, infuriating Kiev, Baltic countries and Central European governments. But he did make amends and do that volte-face, didn't he? French term. So the Parliament report seen by Politico comes as the French government committed this week as a request of MPs to refinance a special fund for Ukraine with 200 million euros after the initial 200 million cash pot was spent. The funders help finance deliveries of optical systems, Caesar self-propelled howitzers, Control Master 200 radars, and 155mm ammunition. So on and so forth. And there's lots more in detail in there, but just be wary about criticising France is my conclusion there. So AP, Associated Press, say the proposed US funding bill excludes Ukraine aid as political battle looms. Goodness me, it's going on. US House Speaker Mike Johnson revealed on November the 11th a new proposal to keep the federal government open, a plan which excludes additional funding for Ukraine. AP reported. He characterized the initiative as placing conference in the best position to fight for fiscal responsibility, oversight over Ukraine aid, and meaningful policy changes at our southern border. The White House slammed the plan as a threat to US national security. And of course, Putin's thinking, yep, love that. Thanks, Mike Johnson. This is not helping. What Mike Johnson is doing is not helping Ukraine and not helping international geopolitical stability. Okay, moving on to geopolitical stuff because I have to run now. Microsoft says that Russia is spreading Middle Eastern disinformation. Russia is actively manufacturing disinformation about the Middle East, according to Microsoft via the chair and President Brad Smith, the Times of Israel has reported. So, Microsoft chief here, Russia has been spreading disinformation about the situation in the Middle East, the president of Microsoft said Saturday, as tensions soar in the region due to the Israel-Hamas war. Brad Smith, Microsoft vice chair and president, was asked about the role of the US tech giant in promoting peace at an international peace forum in Paris. He said that Microsoft and its competitors were fighting against disinformation, in particular by using artificial intelligence. I know Google has been involved in this as well. Smith said that Microsoft and other companies are doing this by creating technological tools that facilitate the detection of manipulated, modified, altered content. We've just had whose voice was faked, and oh my goodness, and that's been a real problem. Oh yeah, that was it. It was the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, who had a deep fake done of his voice that was really controversial, and then it's been found to technically it's not illegal, and this could cause all sorts of problems. We are getting very good at identifying a Russian campaign, like when they tried to tell people not to get the COVID vaccine, he said. Or today, when we see Russian disinformation in the Middle East, he said 3 options facing technology platforms to identify this kind of disinformation are to do nothing, delete it, or relabel it and flag the content as being modified. There is no societal consensus about what companies should do, he added. Paris Peace Forum opened against a backdrop of proliferating conflict around the world. So on and so forth. So that's interesting, and there's a discussion to be had around what to do. Do you shut it down, or is that against free speech? Yeah, but if it's lying, purposeful lying to disinform people for dangerous, malign ends, then actually there's a good call for that to be just shut down, to be deleted. Honestly, I think Ronald Reagan would turn over in his grave if he saw we were not going to help Ukraine. Mitch McConnell, the famous Republican speaker in the Senate, has said in an interview with the Associated Press this week, and I think this is true, there's a lot of Reagan Republicans, there's a lot of you that watch this that really are pro-Ukraine and look at what Mike Johnson is doing in the House of Representatives and say, that's not me. You don't represent me as a kind of Reagan Republican. And here, Mitch McConnell, and I spent many years slagging this guy off, but he's absolutely on point with regard to the Ukraine war. And he needs to be listened to by his Republican colleagues, both in the Senate that are starting to get jittery, but particularly with those fringe ones in the House. And we're going to continue with some American politics, but I have to go now, and I'll come back and do the rest of this video upon my return. Hello, that's a 3-hour break. I'm back from rugby, having just had, my son's team got a tonking, but I'll see where I left off. I have no idea what I'm talking about. Okay, this was it. Cup of tea. Look, merchandise. Marvellous, whatever. Okay. So it's, I think, important to mention people like Trump, and I know many of you say, oh, you're so anti-him, blah, 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 blah. And to a degree, yes, I am. I'm not a big fan of him. But when he starts saying things that pertain to this particular conflict or geopolitical situations, then it is worth mentioning. So he did a rally, as he's used to doing last night. He said, I'll let you hear what he said.
And we're becoming a drug haven. You know, China many years ago was being taken over by much smaller countries because they were all drugged out on the poppy fields, the poppy the drugs, heroin, different drugs, but they were all drugged out. The nation was drugged out. And then along came a very powerful leader. You know who that is? And he said, no more. And from that time, pretty much until now, they've been strong, but they.
I have no idea. I don't think he has any idea what he's talking about. China wasn't a drugged out nation. They weren't being taken over by other countries. This is absolutely insane. But this is, again, appeasing the strong man. I've said to you before, he loves strong men. Kim Jong-un, Jair Bolsonaro, Viktor Orban, and we'll go on to Orban in a second. And now here's Xi Jinping again. But just saying complete nonsense with it.
They were all drugged out, and they were, I mean, our nation's becoming that way, okay? Our nation's becoming that way. You look at our nation, it's that you almost say, how does it survive when so many people are absolutely sick from drugs and drug overdose?
Yeah, you might want to look at Purdue Pharma and other such entities as that before you start ripping off on other countries. Yes, you're right. There are issues with your own pharmaceutical industry and the opiate problem that there is. If anyone wants to see a really good series on that's been dramatized, see Dope Sick on Disney Plus, which is a fantastic rendition, I guess, of that whole opiates crisis. But don't look to China as some kind of shining example of what you want to aspire to here. And this idea that Xi Jinping and he's going to go on and talk about Viktor Orban are somehow brilliant people. Now, this is important because this is a front runner in the Republican race for presidential nominee. And that is an issue with regard to geopolitical ramifications, given that at least in the polls, he's up against, if he goes up against Biden, then he is looking like, as according to New York Times polling recently, looking like a shoo-in, at least in these early polls. So a lot can change, and that can argue about the accuracy of those polls. But nonetheless, this is serious with regard to, well, where would he stand in terms of Ukraine? Well, then when he goes on to express his love affair with Viktor Orban, and Viktor Orban is a pro-Kremlin puppet giving an anti-Ukrainian stance within Europe, things aren't looking good.
So much more. But the head of Hungary, a very tough, strong guy, Viktor Orban. Did anybody ever hear of him? Probably.
Again, it's this love affair with strong men, dictators, that I just listen to the way he speaks about these people.
Considered very powerful within his country and outside of his country. Not exactly loved by some of the European nations because.
Considered very powerful. If you're doing a psychological analysis of what this guy is saying here, the consideration of power, like the perception of power from others, is what's important. So for Trump, if you were a psychotherapist and were to ask Trump, what's really important to you? It would be other people's perception of my power. Strong man, power, blah, blah, blah.
Because he does his thing. He didn't allow millions of people to invade his country. He allowed nobody to invade. Zero. He had nobody. So he doesn't have crime, and he doesn't have the problems that they're having in other countries where
Hungary apparently has absolutely no crime.
Millions of people who are allowed to go in. But they were interviewing him 2 weeks ago, and they said, what would you advise President Obama? The whole world seems to be exploding.
This is, some people are criticizing Trump because he's starting to get really confused in a lot of his speeches, like Joe Biden has been accused of being. So the cognitive decline of Trump and Biden is just not good news for America in general in terms of having people at the top of their game vying to run the country. But when he says Obama, he actually means Joe Biden, in the same way that he keeps saying that Viktor Orban is in charge of Turkey, but it's actually Hungary, although he got it right here.
And imploding. And he said it's very simple. He should immediately resign, and they should replace him with President Trump, who kept the world safe. And I'm not just talking the United States. China respected him. Russia respected him. North Korea respected him. And he used another word other than respect, too. He said fear. But I don't want to use that word.
I want to be clear.
just quite incredible who he talks about. Like, Trump is seen as amazing by China, North Korea, Russia. Just the whole positioning there is fundamentally flawed. Anyway, I thought I'd share that with you because it's interesting to understand where maybe America's position will be given, say, a Trump victory in the 2024 presidential elections. Notwithstanding all of the many legal issues he has, so on and so forth. Right. Ukraine has adopted its 2024 budget amid daunting challenges, says Euromaidan Press. 50% of expenditures and 95% of revenues allocated for defense against Russian aggression. But the country relies on EU and US grants to cover the other half of the costs. The aid faces uncertainty. So this is going to talk about, like I mentioned yesterday, if the US puts a stop to civic funding, for want of a better term, funding outside of the military sphere, as some people are claiming might happen, then that puts the whole country at a very vulnerable point because, without a functioning government, you don't get really a civil society that can itself function. So the question then becomes, well, what are the army fighting for? What are they going back to when they are rotated and have time off? If the whole country is falling to bits because it's not properly funded, then you've got a problem. And supporting Ukraine during this time period in terms of them defending their country is not just to provide tanks and weapons, but to provide them the means to operate as an entire nation. Right, let's now look. Sorry, I can't feel my fingers after the morning out, and I'm pressing all sorts of random stuff here. Bear with me a second. The delights of MS. Right, okay. A Latvian president says the West must arm Ukraine to prevent further Russian aggression. So Latvian President Edgars Rinkēvičs told the Associated Press on November the 11th that he believes Moscow is well prepared for a long war and that the West must keep providing Ukraine with security assistance or else Russia will be emboldened to threaten after other countries in the future. This is one of the worries, of course, for the Baltic nations because of geographically where they are. And if Ukraine was to fall, then, Poland and the Baltics would be next. And that's why they are so big on supporting Ukraine. There's a lot of self-interest involved. Of course, naturally, it's not criticism, but a kind of obvious observation. They are really big on supporting Ukraine for those reasons, and obviously for the right moral reasons too. Latvian president saying the right things there, that we really must continue to support Ukraine as long as it takes, and support them in terms of a much clearer objective. So we are not just in it for as long as it takes, but we are in it to facilitate Ukraine winning as efficiently and as effectively as possible. And I think that's part of the messaging that's missing with a lot of international leaders. Not saying that he's saying that there, but that's what should be said. Right, and finally, Georgia says Ukraine and Moldova, Georgia, Ukraine and Moldova will become EU members at the same time, says Georgian President Salome Zurishvili. This is very overt pro-EU rhetoric from someone they tried to impeach when she returned from the EU on a diplomatic visit. Given that Georgian Dream, the ruling party, even though they started off as a at least nominally pro-EU party, given that that's what the general consensus of the population in Georgia is, to move to the West rather than stay under the influence of the Kremlin. But unfortunately, Georgian Dream have been really under the influence of the Kremlin now for several years, and the president here has enraged those kind of pro-Russian politicians to the point where they impeached her for, doing her job of international diplomacy and politics. That failed. It didn't get through Parliament, luckily. I'd be very interested to see where Georgia go in terms of future elections. There is a lot of the population who is pro-EU and thinks that this would be fantastic if they can join the EU at the same time as Ukraine and Moldova. She says, I think it will happen at the same time. Whether it will happen in 2030, 31, or 2029, I don't know. But this horizon will be next. As they say, Big Bang, the next members will join roughly together. We are a trio, Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, and we have this trio established, she said. This is really interesting bit of geopolitical, I don't know what you call it, positioning, I guess, which is to say, because there was this idea that Moldova and Ukraine are definitely together and will kind of join at the same time, and Georgia's just the candidate nation, just a little bit behind. But actually, she said, no, we're in this together as a threesome. And I think that there's safety in numbers, that kind of idea. But to move closer to Ukraine and Moldova, rhetorically here, is to be amongst like-minded nations and to get that kind of safety in numbers through association. I think this is wise politicking here from the president, the Georgian president. And I think if you kind of piggyback on the back of Ukraine there, then you're more likely to get attention from the EU, support from the EU, and also Georgia and Ukraine and Moldova can have this kind of symbiotic relationship where they all support each other in view of a kind of an attempted Kremlin campaign to bring them under the influence of Russia and into that sphere. I think this is sensible and I like it. So anyway, that's the final piece of the news. Sorry, it's been a bit fragmented due to me running off for 3 hours and then coming back. Anyway, thank you so much. I don't know what I'll be able to do today because I'm just due out to one of the rugby parents and with a number of the other parents to a big sort of roast meal at one of their houses, a bit of a Sunday lunch. So looking forward to that, a rare excursion out the house. Sorry if I am unable to provide all the content I normally would today, but I might try and get at least a frontline update later. I'm due to give you guys an extra that I haven't done for ages, but nonetheless, it is what it is. I'll try and get you some content out later. Anyway, in the meantime, take care. Speak soon.